Hello, this is Bruce Eder, welcoming you to this discussion of the music from Alexander Korda's production of Things to Come, composed by Arthur Bliss and conducted by Mir Matheson. The movie was the conception of H.G. Wells, the renowned author of science-based fiction, speculative fiction, histories, plays, political and social commentaries, futurist and philosophical texts. Wells had worked on 3 short films in the 1920s that he called amateur efforts, but he plunged in with a bold and daring vision to Things to Come, not just in his proposed plot and its range across 100 years of history to come, but also in its structure. And central to that structure was music. In Wells's vision, as recalled by Arthur Bliss, music was to play as large a role as dialogue in the presentation of the film, and an even more vital role than dialogue in the overall structure and unity of the movie. And all of this was true despite the fact that Wells was no musician. It was an imposing creation in music as much as cinema, and in film music even more so, for it showed the way for a future of celebrated film scores and concert music by the likes of William Walton, Ralph Vaughan Williams, and Leonard Bernstein, to name a few. H.G. Wells first encountered Arthur Bliss in 1934, when the composer gave a lecture in aspects of contemporary music. Bliss served in combat during the First World War, in which his younger brother Kennard, seen on the left in this picture, was killed. That was a loss from which he never fully recovered, and was the inspiration for one of his most important and heartfelt pieces, the choral symphonic work Morning Heroes, composed at the very end of the 1920s. In the lecture that Wells attended, the author saw in the composer an intellectual idealism that marked him as a potential kindred spirit, and he seemed a natural ally for the film project at hand. According to Bliss, the author had outlined his screenplay virtually as a symphonic structure, and then, in their discussions, he realized that Wells had in mind something closer to grand opera, albeit of a very modern sort, with music all the way through as the unifying medium, of necessity composed before the words were written or the images devised and shot. The dialogue was to be the equivalent of arias and recitative, emphasizing important points and advancing elements of plot. But the music would come first and drive the whole piece. Korda wouldn't allow the movie to be made that way, shot to a fully composed and recorded music score. Strangely enough, about 15 years after Things to Come, Korda did agree to the making of a movie precisely in this way, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's production of The Tales of Hoffmann. It was made exactly the way that Wells proposed making Things to Come, and, in fact, utilized the same film stages, unsoundproofed, where the special effects sequences for Things to Come had been shot for all of its photography. In the mid-1930s, however, this seemed far too radical and unconventional, and Korda preferred the Hollywood method, by which the film is written, shot, and edited, and then the scoring is added. But Korda had given Wells the freedom to write the screenplay, and couldn't very well cut him off from a chosen collaborator, and so Bliss and Wells worked together at the screenplay stage, which was extremely unusual for a film. For starters, there is the prelude, following the introduction of the chiming bells. It's thick with Schumann-like elements, very dark and profound and serious. You must recognize that for audiences in 1936, this was a very thick and lush score to begin with, almost an assault on the ears by the standards of the time. These were more instruments playing more notes than audiences had been accustomed to in a dramatic, non-musical film. Movies might have been entertainment for the masses on a much bigger scale than classical music, but this prelude told you how much the makers expected from the film audience in terms of appreciation of a score. Bliss's opening music wasn't rousing, but it was profound. Perhaps too much so in some ways, which was a problem with the movie as well, in terms of its successfully achieving mass appeal. Critics mostly loved it, but the viewing public found it too cold and emotionless and challenging. In many respects, it had the same kinds of flaws that critics and some audiences found with Kubrick's 2001. Characters with little or no development, who were simply symbolic figures there to state ideas and represent aspects of the human condition in some kind of a larger cinematic statement about mankind's future. As it happened, the future looked very bleak in 1936. Less than 20 years after the end of the World War, as it was then known, the whole world was rearming again, and the democratically elected governments of the world were at a loss to know what to do about it. A lot of that feeling was captured in these early scenes. The last idyllic Christmas that anyone in the picture or their descendants will ever know, as it turns out.
The toys we had were simpler, ever so much simpler. Noah's arks and wooden soldiers. Nothing complex like these. You know, I wonder sometimes if perhaps all these new toys aren't a bit too much for them.
This is the lightest part of the score, but it has some of the most serious implications. The reeds and strings are almost dancing playfully as the children enjoy their toys, oblivious to the worries of the adults around them.
Don't be too sure of progress.
Oh, listen to the incurable pessimist.
What's to stop progress nowadays? War.
The music weaves in and out of the dialogue, far more prominent than was typical of the time in underscoring, because this isn't underscoring in the musical sense. It's giving tone and shape and irony to the dialogue about war. Bliss wrote his music ahead of shooting. It was going to have to be recorded anew for the actual film once that was prepared, but the composer was on to other projects by then. And besides, most composers for the concert hall, as it turns out, are not necessarily prepared to realize their music in a finished state for film. And in this case, the actual recording for the film soundtrack was left to Muir Matheson.
Goodbye, son. There.
Quick, boss.
And then comes the March to War, which, once heard, no one ever seems to forget.
An air raid is approaching every town. Gas masks are being distributed. See the boats get tightly behind the air. Get to cover. Get under cover at once. The enemy are not in any great force, and our anti-aircraft gunners will speedily dispose of them.
As a piece of freestanding music, it's powerful. It seems remote to us today, but in 1936, this would have seemed like scenes from a nightmare, a horror film. And the attack music is every bit as savage as the best battle music written for the concert hall. In fact, I'm frequently amazed by the number of people who have never seen the film but know this piece. war montage was similarly nightmarish in its time and filled with irony. We see contemporary armored tanks give way to sleek Art Deco-style vehicles just as deadly, and stalemate as each side digs in for a war of attrition which, as with the First World War, lasts for years, and in this case, then decades. So when you look at these scenes, think of them as having that kind of impact on the intended audience. This wasn't fiction entirely, and not just imaginings, for as Wells reminds us with these Art Deco tanks, only the weapons got bigger and better. And then there is what looks like a mushroom cloud over the year 1945. Bliss knew what horror he was depicting. He'd felt it himself from the death of his brother Kennard and the death of a whole generation of young composers and musicians in his time. And he rose to the occasion here, and he sweeps us along. The music works by itself, but heard properly under Matheson's baton, it's a greater work still, one of the finest musical representations of battle and ruin that I know.
Do you realize the immense task we shall undertake when we set ourselves to an active and aggressive peace? When we direct our energies to tear out the wealth of this planet and exploit all these giant possibilities of science that have been squandered hitherto upon war and senseless competition. We shall excavate the eternal hills. We shall make such use of the treasures of sky and sea and earth as men have never dreamt of hitherto. I would that I could see our children's children in this world we shall win for them. But in them and through them, we shall live again.
The entire sequence that follows was unique in its time, with the film prepared under the guidance of the music. This was where Wells, Bliss, Matheson, and Korda, and all of the men working for him, are on exactly the same page. Although Wells, of all people, initially objected to Bliss's music for this sequence, with its emphasis on percussion, Wells felt that Bliss had missed the point that the machines of the future would be silent. Bliss employed an array of percussion instruments more impressive than even Verdi's Anvil Chorus from Trovatore, and the author did relent in his objections. This section of the score is of a piece with other concert works of the era that sought to depict machines and industrial activity. Mossilov's The Iron Foundry comes to mind, as does Antheil's Ballet Mécanique and Honegger's Pacific 231. The music was probably the most successful aspect of Things to Come. Bliss conducted dozens, even hundreds of performances over the decades that followed. Even before the movie's opening, the composer had assembled a concert suite for a performance at one of the London Promenade concerts in 1935 from the material he had written in the pre-production phase of the picture. This suite was altered several times over the next year or so, as Bliss sought to conform what audiences heard at his performances with what was heard in the film. The music for Things to Come appeared on a soundtrack album, a package of 378 RPM shellac discs in 1935, which also comprised the first commercial issue of any of Bliss's orchestral music and Bliss's first commercially issued recordings as a conductor. And if it didn't exactly start a wave of serious composers lining up to write for motion pictures, it did show how a successful collaboration could work between a composer and a producer. As for Arthur Bliss, he was knighted in 1950, and in 1953, following the death of Sir Arnold Bax, he was appointed Master of the Queen's Music, the equivalent of being Poet Laureate. He remained active into the mid-1970s and passed away in 1975.
It is this or that. All the universe or nothingness. Which shall it be, husband? Which shall it be?
This is Bruce Eder, and I'd like to thank you for joining me on this tour through the music of things to come.